Can we actually map out the future? For thousands of years, we've looked to mystics and the stars for answers. But what if the key isn't out there? What if it's buried in our own past? What if we could use the mountains of data from human history to forecast the big picture trends of our future? Well, let's find out. And let's be clear, the stakes here are about as high as they get. We're not talking about predicting the stock market or who's going to win an election. We're talking about the rise and fall of entire civilizations. So by digging through history for these hidden patterns, can we see a collapse coming? And, the really important question, can we do anything to stop it? Now, if this is all starting to sound a little like science fiction, well, you're not wrong. The legendary Isaac Asimov dreamt up this idea of psychohistory, a mathematical science that could predict the future of vast galactic empires. But here's the thing. What was once just a cool idea in a novel is now a very real, very serious field of study. It's called cryodynamics. Think of it as physics for history. It gets its name from Clio, the Greek muse of history, and dynamics, the study of how things change. The whole point is to stop seeing history as just a random series of one-off events and start treating it like a science, to find those deep underlying forces that shape our world on a massive scale. Okay, so how does this actually work in the real world? Let's dive into our first case study, a time when the data was basically screaming that humanity was driving full speed towards a cliff. So, take a look at the blue line on this chart. It's showing human population growth kicking off around the Industrial Revolution. For almost 300 years, starting around 1680, our population wasn't just growing, it was growing at a faster and faster rate. It was a hyperbolic curve, and this incredibly consistent pattern led some scientists to a pretty terrifying conclusion. Get this. Back in 1960, a major paper published in the journal Science took that blue line and just extended it into the future. The math pointed to a singularity, a point where the population would theoretically become infinite on Friday, November 13th, 2026, a doomsday. Now, obviously, the population wouldn't actually become infinite, but the model predicted some kind of catastrophic collapse of our global system right around that date. But here we are. So what happened? The prediction was totally solid, based on a pattern that held true for centuries. And then, all of a sudden, it just stopped. Right around the mid-1960s, the entire global system swerved. And you can see it right here. That's the change. See the red line? The runaway train just stopped accelerating. Our growth rate actually started to slow down, flipping from a pattern of critical explosion to something called reversed criticality. It's like we felt the echo of a singularity that was suddenly in our past, not our future. We literally pulled back from the brink. So this is the really crucial point here. The pattern was real. There was a powerful, measurable force pushing us towards a breaking point. But human systems are incredibly complex, and it turns out they can change course. This crossover proved that even though these deep historical forces are real, they're not unbreakable laws. We're not just passengers on this ride. We can, collectively, actually steer the ship. Okay, so that doomsday scenario was a huge, one-time smurf, a single trend that completely reversed course. But what about patterns that don't just happen once? What about patterns that repeat? Well, cryodynamics also finds these recurring cycles, and one of the most powerful ones seems to be this constant engine of boom and bust, and it's fueled by inequality. Yeah, it turns out that several of these models point to the same thing. The way wealth is spread out, or not spread out, in a society is a massive driver of its stability. You can almost think of it like a scale. When that gap between the rich and poor gets too big, the whole system becomes unbalanced and unstable, creating these internal pressures that can easily lead to chaos. So here's a pretty simple model of how this cycle works. First up, you have the economic engine. Wealth tends to grow multiplicatively, like compound interest, which naturally over time creates a bigger and bigger gap. Then comes the social trigger. As inequality grows, the average wealth gets dragged way up by the super rich, so a larger and larger percentage of the population actually falls below that average. That creates a lot of dissatisfaction, a sense that the system is unfair. And finally, you get the cascade. The society is so fragile at this point that a tiny spark, a protest, a market crash, anything, can set off a chain reaction of unrest that ends up destroying wealth and, in a way, hitting the reset button on the whole system. So this creates what you could call a two-stroke engine of history. You've got the boom phase, where wealth is growing, but so is inequality and social tension. Then you get the bust phase. This is when the turmoil hits.
wealth gets destroyed, inequality is reduced, and the system returns to a more stable state, ready to start the whole cycle all over again. It's this constant ebb and flow.
And if you're thinking this is just some modern problem, a feature of capitalism or something, think again. This chart here shows the relative growth rate of the human population going back millennia. You can clearly see these cycles, these periods of rapid growth followed by a crash or stagnation long before the Industrial Revolution even existed. These boom and bust dynamics seem to be a really deep, fundamental part of how human societies work.
All right, so we've seen a doomsday that never happened and a boom-bust cycle that seems to happen over and over again. So what's the big picture here? What's the real power of looking at history in this way?
This is probably the best analogy for it. Cryodynamics is not a crystal ball. It can't predict the weather. It can't tell you the outcome of a specific election or who will win a single battle. But what it can do is help us understand the climate. It helps us see the long-term pressures building up in a society, like rising inequality or population stress, that make certain types of events more and more likely. It's about seeing the storm forming on the horizon, not predicting the exact second the first raindrop will fall.
So let's just boil it all down. The most important takeaway is that history isn't just a random chain of events. There are real structural forces at work. But, and this is a huge but, just like we saw with that doomsday prediction, these forces aren't our destiny. We can and we do change course. We've seen that population changes and wealth inequality are two incredibly powerful engines that drive history. And this isn't just theory. Scientists are constantly testing these models against huge historical databases to see if they hold up.
And that brings us right here to today. It's the final, crucial question, isn't it? We dodged one bullet by completely changing our global population trend. But that boom and bust engine of inequality, it's still running. By understanding these patterns, we're essentially giving ourselves a new kind of map of the future. The question is no longer, can we predict history? But will we use that knowledge to try and build a better future? So what patterns are you seeing